Today, we're exploring a huge shift in Islamic history, the move from the Quran to the Hadith.
And this is the core question behind the book From Quranic Islam to Hadith Islam. In the very beginning, the Prophet Muhammad would wait for divine revelation to answer questions.
See, his role was as a messenger, not a lawmaker. He'd wait for the Quran's guidance,
and it was only after he admitted, "I do not know," that a new revelation came down with the answer.
But after the Prophet's death, everything changed. The faith just exploded across the map.
This massive expansion brought in new people, new cultures, and a ton of new problems.
Suddenly you had all these questions that the Quran didn't have explicit answers for.
So to fill that legal gap, a whole new source of authority appeared, the Hadith.
The Hadith became like a second revelation. But this sparked a brand new debate.
Basically, two camps formed, one that used reason and one that stuck strictly to the text.
Then Imam Shafi's work really solidified the Hadith's authority, giving the text-based schools an edge.
But a huge problem popped up. As more traditions were collected, you found conflicting hadiths.
For example, one hadith says flat out, fairies don't exist.
But then another one tells a whole story about the Prophet talking to a fairy. So, which is it?
The school of text had a simple solution. Just submit to the text. No questions asked.
The book argues this led to a paralysis of reason. You just weren't allowed to question it.
And this idea was incredibly popular. We're talking an estimated 2.5 million people at one leader's funeral. This victory, the author argues, was the decisive shift from Quranic Islam to Hadith Islam.
And this had massive long-term consequences for law, thought, and Islamic civilization.
This quote really sums up the author's whole argument about what was lost in this transformation.
it leaves you wondering, when a tradition evolves, what's gained and what gets left behind?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating argument from Georges Tarabishi's work about a huge shift in Islamic history, what he calls the move from an Islam of the Quran to an Islam of the Hadith.
So how are we going to map this whole journey? Well, we'll walk through 5 key stages. We're going to start with the 2 big sources of authority, then look at what the book argues was the original model, where revelation was everything. After that, we'll get into the massive debate between reason and narration, see how they dealt with some tricky contradictions, and finally, explore how the Hadith school came out on top.
All right, first things first. To really get what this is all about, we have to understand the 2 main players, the 2 core sources at the heart of this entire discussion, the Quran and the Hadith. And right here on this slide, you can see the central tension the book is built on. On one side, you have the Quran, a single divine book considered the direct word of God, all completed in that first century of Islam. But then on the other side, you've got the Hadith, and that's not one book. It's this vast, sprawling collection of literally thousands of reports about what the Prophet said and did, and it was compiled over hundreds of years. This difference is the launchpad for the book's entire argument. So let's rewind. What was the original setup according to this analysis? Well, the argument is that in the beginning, the model for authority was incredibly simple and direct. Divine revelation, or wahi, was the ultimate source, and the Prophet Muhammad's role was to be its faithful messenger, period. The book really builds its case by pointing to a specific pattern you see in the Quran. The community would ask the Prophet a question about, new moons or charity or fighting, and his response, as commanded in the text, starts with the word say. The argument is that this isn't just a turn of phrase. It shows he wasn't giving his own personal take. He was literally waiting for God's answer and then delivering it. And if you want the ultimate example of this, the source points to the famous Ifk incident, the terrible slander against the Prophet's wife Aisha. This is presented as the absolute proof. I mean, think about it. This was a huge personal and political crisis, but the Prophet didn't just step in and pass judgment. No, he waited for almost a month until divine revelation, the Nur Surah, came down and proved her innocence. For the author, that action speaks louder than anything else.
So if revelation was number 1, what changed? Well, as the Islamic empire just exploded in size, it started facing all these new problems, legal issues, administrative headaches that just weren't explicitly covered in the Quran. This created a kind of vacuum, and it kicked off a huge, fierce debate about how to fill it.
And this sparked one of the biggest intellectual battles in Islamic history. You basically had 2 camps. On one side, the Ahl al-Ra'i, the people of reason, who said, hey, we should use our minds, our scholarly opinion, to figure out new laws. But on the other side, you had the Ahl al-Hadith, the people of Hadith, and they were adamant the only legitimate source besides the Quran was a direct, explicit text narrated from the Prophet himself. And this quote right here from the scholar Ibn Hazm just perfectly captures the mindset of the Ahl al-Hadith. Their principle was absolute. If a narration, a text, existed on a topic, then human reason had to take a backseat. The author even calls this idea the paralysis of reason, whenever it came face to face with a text. Okay, but here's the thing. If you're going to build your whole system on thousands and thousands of narrations, you are going to run into a problem. A big one. With that many reports, collected by different people over centuries, well, contradictions were bound to pop up. And to show how scholars dealt with this, the book brings up this absolutely fantastic, kind of quirky example, the question of whether or not ghouls are real. So you see the pickle they were in, right? On the one hand, you have a hadith that seems to say flat out, nope, no ghouls. But then you have this other detailed story where the Prophet is basically giving a how-to guide for catching a ghoul that's stealing dates. So what do? You can't just throw one of them out. The texts are both considered authentic. Well, the solution was a really sophisticated intellectual tool called tahriq. And the name literally means seeking a way out. It was this whole method of interpretation designed to make conflicting reports work together. The goal wasn't to prove one was right and one was wrong, but to find a clever way to make them both true, maybe by saying they apply to different things or that one has a hidden meaning. So we've got this epic showdown between Team Reason and Team Narration. How did it all end? The source argues that the Hadith school didn't just win on intellectual grounds. Their victory was sealed by a powerful 1-2 punch of politics and massive popular support. Politically, the whole game changed. In the early 9th century, the state was actually on the side of the rationalists. But then, smack in the middle of the century, Caliph al-Mutawakkil comes to power and does a complete 180. He flips state policy, stops the persecution of the Hadith scholars, and throws all the power and money of the state behind them. This was a huge turning point. And this top-down political shift was supercharged by this incredible support from the ground up. The poster child for this movement was Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the great champion of the Hadith school. I mean, get this. When he died, the source cites accounts that claim up to 2.5 million people showed up for his funeral in Baghdad. 2.5 million. That's just a staggering show of public devotion. And after he died, his legend only grew. His authority was cemented by all these stories of miracles that started to circulate. Stories about his clothes miraculously staying on during a public beating, about his prayer shirt surviving a fire, even about sacred hairs from the Prophet Muhammad himself being sewn into his clothes. These stories basically elevated him from a respected scholar to a saint-like figure. And so, in the end, the victory was complete. The whole paradigm flipped on its head. As Ibn Hanbal himself put it, the Prophet's way of life, the Sunnah, recorded in the Hadith, wasn't just a secondary source anymore. It became the ultimate authority, the main lens you had to use to even understand the Quran. The original hierarchy was completely inverted. And this brings us right to the book's final lingering thought. By walking us through this massive historical shift from relying on revelation and reason to the absolute dominance of narrated texts, Tarabishi leaves us with this really big provocative question, one that goes way beyond the specific history. What happens to any civilization when one way of thinking wins so completely over another? What are the long-term consequences when one intellectual door is shut?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling a foundational question, one that really reshaped one of the world's great civilizations.
We really are.
We're charting this seismic shift in early Islamic thought. The journey from an emphasis on the Quran as the sole foundational authority to the centrality of the prophetic tradition.
What's known as the Hadith or Sunnah.
Exactly.
And this deep dive is based on a stack of truly insightful sources, particularly one that frames this whole transition as a move from what it calls Quran Islam to Hadith Islam.
Right.
And the material really demands that we look beyond just the law, beyond jurisprudence, and dive deep into the theology, the politics, the history.
Because it all comes back to that fundamental pivot point you mentioned.
Yeah.
The source of authority.
That's it. We have to answer the question, who is the shuri, the lawmaker in Islam?
And when you first pose that, I mean, the answer seems so obvious to anyone with a basic familiarity, right? God. God, or Allah, is the sole source of law.
It seems obvious.
So what is it about that simple principle that becomes complicated enough to spark centuries of what you could call intellectual war.
Well, the complexity comes in when you try to define the role of the Prophet Muhammad himself, the messenger who delivered the law.
Okay.
The conflict is all about legislative authority, or tashri. If God is the only source of law, then the prophet's role is restricted to conveying that law. He's the recipient.
He's the channel.
He's the channel. But if, and this is the huge if he possesses independent legislative authority, then his personal words, his actions, his approvals, the sun, they become binding universal law.
On equal footing with the Quran.
On equal footing, or as some came to argue, sometimes even superior to it.
Yeah.
And that distinction, that's the bedrock of the entire debate.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's look at the language the Quran itself uses to describe the prophet's function. The source material seems to focus really intently on this difference between a messenger and a prophet.
It does, and for good reason. The source material meticulously analyzes the Quranic terminology. When it's addressing Muhammad, the Quran uses the title Rasulullah, Messenger of God, dozens of times.
Right.
But here's the critical point, the semantic distinction that scholars have noted. The Quran never uses the title Nabiyullah, or Prophet of God, in a single verse when it's talking about his role in conveying divine instruction.
That feels subtle, but loaded with a ton of theological weight. Why would messenger, Rasul, be so distinct from prophet, Nabi in this specific context?
The authors we're looking at suggest it is absolutely not accidental, it's definitive. A Rasul, a messenger, is someone sent with a specific message. Their duty is conveyance.
Transmission.
Purely transmission. Their role is inherently limited. The messenger is the object, the recipient, the meful of the divine law. He is not, the source argues, intended to be the active subject, the agent, or the independent source, the fail of that law.
So his personal judgment, when it's not backed by a direct revelation, it just remains human.
It remains human, exactly.
Yeah. So by being explicitly defined as a Rasulullah, the Quran is essentially, preemptively setting up a boundary, making sure that legislative power stays with the divine source.
That's the argument. And if we accept that framework, you can see where the Quran explicitly asserts this limitation on the prophet's own agency.
Where do we see that?
Well, take the verse from Ali Imran, chapter 3, verse 128. It's so direct. It says, "This matter is not yours in the least."
Wow.
That is a profound restriction. It's indicating that the ultimate decisions, whether it's about the fate of the community, victory in battle, forgiveness, they belong exclusively to God. It prevents the messenger from taking on the role of, the ultimate sovereign or the final arbiter.
And it's not just about that final judgment, is it? The source also points out that he was corrected or guided when his own human response may be preempted or deviated from the divine will, even slightly.
Precisely. You see these instances where the prophet is subtly warned or even critiqued for acting too quickly or relying on a personal assumption without waiting for that divine instruction to come through.
Is there an example of that?
A classic one mentioned in historical texts, like Tabari's, concerns a warning about speaking on undecided matters. The messenger was warned not to say, "I will do that tomorrow," without immediately linking it to God's will by saying, "Insha'Allah."
If God wills it.
Right. This reinforces the understanding that even his plans for the future had to acknowledge his absolute reliance on being the meful, the recipient of permission, and not the independent fail, the agent of action. He has to wait for the command.
Which indicates his personal judgment is always subject to guidance. And that sets the stage perfectly for our next point, the essential human element of the messenger.
It does.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit more. If the messenger's legislative authority is limited to just conveyance, we have to look at these instances where the divine text corrected or guided his personal decisions. This is where it gets really interesting because it highlights his human nature, his bashariya, versus the infallible revelation, the wahy.
Indeed. And the fundamental theological assertion is that the prophet was a human, a bashar, who received revelation. Fussilat, chapter 41, verse 6, makes this crystal clear. Say, "I am only a man like you, to whom revelation is granted."
So outside of that precise moment of receiving, that immediate, infallible communication, he was, by definition, subject to the same human limitations, right? Errors in judgment, personal preferences, just like anyone else.
That's the core of it. It's crucial to distinguish between the message, which is perfect, and the vehicle, which is human.
And the source gives a really famous, powerful example of this divine intervention correcting a choice that was made out of, human but flawed priorities. The case of the blind man, Abdullah bi Maktoum.
This anecdote from the Abis Surah, which means he frowned, is incredibly illuminating. It involves this clash between diplomatic strategy and spiritual priority.
Right.
The narrative puts the prophet in this crucial moment. He's deeply engaged with the wealthy, influential leaders of the Quraysh tribe. He's desperately hoping to gain their acceptance, to stem the persecution of the early Muslims.
A high-stakes meeting.
Very high stakes. And at that exact moment, Abdullah b. Maktum, who is blind and already a believer, comes up to him seeking religious instruction.
And the prophet, totally focused on this huge potential conversion of the Quraysh leaders, he reacts with impatience.
Yes. In what was a very human, you could even say a rational strategic judgment, he frowned and turned his attention away from the blind man who was already saved toward these powerful individuals whose conversion could benefit the entire community.
And then the revelation comes.
Immediately. The opening verses of the Abyss Surah were revealed as a sharp, direct critique of this conduct. He frowned and turned away, because there came to him the blind man. But what would make you perceive that perhaps he might be purified?
That's a remarkable display of divine priority, isn't it? Choosing the spiritual need of the poor man who's already committed over the political expediency of trying to attract the wealthy elite.
Absolutely. The source notes this critique was so potent that it prompted the prophet to immediately drop the page he was writing on. And in the future, he'd reverse his priority, often specifically turning away from the Quraysh leaders to prioritize those who came seeking sincere guidance.
So it establishes a clear hierarchy.
A very clear one. The immediate needs of the devoted believer outweigh the diplomatic goals of converting the powerful. It shows divine instruction overriding his personal strategic judgment.
So his role was fundamentally restricted to conveying and warning. He didn't have independent authority to prioritize human affairs, even if the goal was piety. His job was to deliver the message, not guarantee the outcome.
That's the key takeaway. And the source material cites several other verses reinforcing this. The power of guidance, hidayat, belongs exclusively to God. Baqarah 2.272 makes this explicit. It is not for you, Muhammad, to guide them, but Allah guides whom He wills.
Right.
Similarly, in other places, He's clearly prohibited from, say, cursing certain polytheists or taking ultimate authority in judging people's inner state. His task is conveyance and warning. That's it.
Let's delve a bit further into this human limitation, especially how it affected his role in forming legislative decisions. There's an account of a delayed ayah, a verse, about those who stay home from battle, which really highlights how he had to wait for divine instruction, not just act on his own inference.
This is a superb technical example from the Nisa Surah. The prophet was receiving and recording the revelation, detailing the virtues and reward for those who went out to fight, the mujahideen. And in his understanding, the text was essentially finalized.
But then something happens that shows the dynamic, responsive nature of the revelation process.
Exactly. At that point, Ibn Maktum, the same blind companion, approaches and asks the critical question. What about those of us who are physically disabled and genuinely cannot participate?
And the prophet didn't just say, oh, of course you're exempt.
He didn't. He waited. He held the ruling open, which indicates the legislation was incomplete. The sources say he immediately entered a state of receiving revelation because of the question, and that resulted in the addition of the phrase, except those with a valid excuse. The divine text arrived to complete the legislation. It shows that even in a matter of obvious compassion and practical necessity, the ruling was incomplete until the divine text came down. He relied on instruction, not independent judgment.
That reliance on instruction becomes absolutely paramount when we consider the most dramatic and contentious story about human fallibility in the sources. The Quranic or the Satanic Verses incident.
This incident, and it is highly disputed by later scholars, is pivotal because its very existence in the historical record serves as the strongest possible demonstration of the prophet's potential human fallibility before a divine correction.
So what's the story?
The narrative, which you find in early sources like Tabari, describes the prophet's profound desire to ease the tension and hostility from the powerful Meccan polytheists.
And what did that desperation lead him to do, according to this narrative?
While he was reciting the next surah, which mentions the idols Alat and Aloza, the prophet, allegedly due to a slip of the tongue or an auditory intrusion ascribed to a satanic edition, included two phrases that praise these idols. Something like, they are the high-flying cranes whose intercession is hoped for.
Which would be a huge concession.
A monumental one. A momentary human failure to perfectly preserve the Weli.
And the immediate social and political consequences must have been explosive.
Catastrophic for the identity of the early Muslim community. The narrative claims everyone, Muslims, polytheists, and even jinn all prostrated after the recitation because the message seemed to offer compromise. The polytheists were ecstatic. They thought the conflict was over.
But that relief was short-lived.
Very, because the error was quickly identified and corrected. Gabriel later came, abrogating or replacing the faulty verses, which caused the prophet immense psychological distress. The source uses this incident to showcase that the integrity of the message was protected by God, even if the vehicle, the human recipient, could temporarily make a mistake.
Okay, now, you mentioned this is highly controversial. How do scholars, past and present, deal with a story that seems to fundamentally question the prophet's infallibility in conveying the message?
The source material lays out a few key approaches. Some modern rationalist scholars, like Fazlur Rahman, they argued that, yes, the incident was possible, precisely because the prophet possessed a human nature.
He wasn't exempt from error.
Exactly. He was not muwafa masa, not exempt from error in his ordinary state, which makes a temporary slip like that possible before the final divine correction sealed the text. That view aligns perfectly with the emphasis on his bashariya, his humanity.
But other scholars say the whole story is a fabrication designed to undermine Islam from the inside.
Absolutely. The dominant view among many classical and contemporary scholars is that the Quranic event is entirely fabricated, a zinklerin ududu, a story spread by heretics.
What's their argument?
They point to logical inconsistencies. For example, the verses in the Nechem Surah that immediately follow the ones in question. They heavily criticize those very same deities.
So the Meccan leaders would have heard the praise and then immediately heard the condemnation.
Right. Why would they have prostrated in joy? They argue the timeline and the textual context just make the whole narrative nonsensical. They see it as politically motivated by opponents of Islam.
So regardless of whether it's historically verifiable, the very debate around Quranic highlights the core struggle we're tracking, trying to establish the precise limits of the prophet's authority. Was he merely the conveyor, or did his human agency also carry divine legislative weight?
That is the perfect transition, this theological struggle. It leads us directly to the great historical pivot point. The challenge in the later centuries was this. If the Quran itself restricted the prophet's role to conveyance, and his human judgment was repeatedly corrected, how on earth did his personal words and actions become an independent source of universal infallible legislation?
That transition sounds like the moment the authority irrevocably shifted from the explicit, singular divine word to the expansive, transmitted human tradition.
And it was a transition dictated by geopolitical necessity. Originally, Islam was centered on Medina and was characterized by the al-Quran, the people of the Quran. Legal matters were often handled through, community consensus, local traditions, or direct interpretation of the limited Quranic legislation.
But then came the Futuhat, that astonishing period of rapid conquest and empire building.
Precisely. Islam explodes from a local phenomenon into Futuhat Islam, an imperial civilization stretching from Spain to Central Asia. And this sudden expansion meant absorbing vast territories and cultures, Byzantine, Sasanian, Persian, Hellenistic, each with its own complex legal systems.
Things like land tenure, taxation, inheritance, marriage customs, commerce.
All of it.
The Quran simply couldn't provide immediate granular rulings for every single complex administrative and legal situation that's popping up across this sprawling new empire.
It couldn't. It wasn't designed for that. The Quran offers broad ethical and legal principles, but the imperial administration needed specific, scalable laws to govern millions of non-Arab subjects. This administrative vacuum demanded the creation of an expansive legal framework.
And that framework became the Nabawi Sunnat, the prophetic tradition.
It became the required legal and administrative baggage for this new civilization to function.
So the key intellectual change was really driven by this practical imperial necessity. The recipient of the law had to be functionally reimagined as the lawmaker.
That's it, exactly. The theological transformation was that the messenger, who was restricted by the Quran to conveyance, was recast as the Sunnat Koyan, the one who establishes binding, universal law through his every deed, word, and silent approval. And this elevation was essential for legitimizing all the new laws and customs being codified by the emerging legal scholars across the empire.
And this marks the true birth of Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh. How did the early legal schools navigate this tension between pragmatic necessity and rigid adherence to tradition?
Well, fiqh wasn't born overnight. It developed over about 300 years, gradually formalizing the legal system until it occupied the central role that secular law held in Roman civilization.
And the internal tension was fierce.
Fierce. It primarily divided scholars into two camps: the al-Ray, the people of opinion or reason, and the al-Hadith, the people of Hadith. The al-Ray prioritized rational deliberation, interpretation, and local custom, while the al-Hadith demanded strict adherence only to transmitted reports, fearing that human reason would corrupt the divine message.
Let's focus on one of the earliest representatives of that al-Ray approach, Malik bin Anas, the founder of the Maliki school in Medina. How flexible was his approach to law?
Malik, who was active in the 2nd century of Islam, represented a relatively flexible early form of rationalistic thought. He felt free to apply his personal judgment, his ray, when a clear, universally accepted text wasn't available. And the sources we have meticulously document this.
How did he express that personal judgment? What kind of language did he use?
He used subjective language, not strictly objective language. The source documents that Malik frequently used personal judgment phrases like era, I think, or la era, I do not think.
Really?
Yes. These phrases, showing his preference or his considered judgment, were counted 95 times in his foundational legal work, the Muwatta. He also used expressions like Hahibu, I prefer, and Ekrahuhu, I dislike.
That seems incredibly modern, almost secular, in its reliance on a scholar's personal opinion rather than only explicit divine text.
It was daring, and it put him at odds with the emerging Hadith purists. Crucially, Malik's jurisprudence often contradicted reports from the Prophet or early companions if he felt those reports were inconsistent with the long-standing established practice of the city of Medina.
So he preferred the amal of the people of Medina, the established local practice, over a potentially dubious hadith report brought in by some traveler from a distant province.
Exactly. For Malik, the consistent inherited practice of the earliest community in the original home of Islam often superseded a single-chain hadith, whose chain might look technically sound, but whose content seemed foreign to Medina's culture. It grounded his approach in a living, local tradition.
And he was skeptical.
Very. He reportedly said he met 70 narrators by the mosque pillars who claimed to speak in the Prophet's name, but he took nothing from them, asserting they were not the people of this business. He questioned the trustworthiness of the source material itself, prioritizing stability over just the quantity of reports.
So Malik represents a high point of legal freedom and reason. Who stands at the absolute opposite pole? The triumph of pure, literal adherence to the transmitted text.
That would have to be the Zahiri school, the literalist school, most powerfully championed by the 10th century scholar Ibn Hazm. He stood completely outside the four main schools. His methodology was absolute literal adherence to the Nas, the explicit text of the Quran, or an authentic sunnah or a consensus.
And his core rejection was qiyas, or analogical reasoning.
Total, absolute rejection. Ibn Hazm saw qiyas as completely invalid, arguing that applying analogical reasoning was basically a sin or even outright disbelief, kufr, because it forced God to say something he hadn't explicitly said.
You're usurping divine authority.
You're usurping divine authority.
But practically speaking, I mean, this rejection of analogy seems like it would create a kind of legal paralysis, especially for an empire that's constantly dealing with new products, new situations, new cultural contexts.
It did. It resulted in an extreme, often impractical literalism. The source material provides some stunning examples of the rigidity this caused. For zakat, the obligatory poor due, Ibn Hazm rejected it on virtually all new commercial and agricultural products.
Like what?
He rejected zakat on horses, slaves, rice, corn, most fruits, vegetables, crucial trade goods. He only recognized zakat on the few items explicitly mentioned in the foundational texts, like gold, silver, camels, cows, specific grains.
So if you were a wealthy merchant trading in, say, spices or textiles, you paid no zakat?
Not according to him. But the most illustrative example is the hadith about sanitation. There was a report that said, if a mouse died in liquid fat, you have to pour the fat out.
Okay, seems reasonable.
Ibn Hazm, applying his strict literalism, argued that this ruling applied only to liquid fat and only to a mouse. If, say, a sewer rat, a far more impure animal, died in a vessel of olive oil, a similar liquid, the owner was not obliged to pour it out.
Wait, why not? Logically, the sewer rat is worse, and olive oil is a liquid fat.
Because the Nas, the explicit text, did not specifically name sewer rat or olive oil. To extend the ruling would require qiyas, analogical reasoning, which he rejected as invalid. If the divine text didn't specify the exact scenario, no law existed beyond the literal terms of the hadith itself.
Wow. That just showcases the intellectual crisis created by this kind of hyperliteralism.
It does.
This intellectual rigidity, this conflict between Riley and Hadith, it didn't just define legal details. It quickly spilled over into the very foundation of textual authority, leading to the necessary invention of mechanisms like naskh or abrogation.
That's the transition. The sheer volume of Hadith and the desire of the Hadith to elevate it to universal law. It required a tool to resolve internal contradictions and conflicts with the Quran. Naskh provided that crucial mechanism. It declared one text, the mansukh, as nullified by a later text, the nasikh.
The idea of abrogation within the Quran itself is one thing, it's self-referential. But the most radical theological step here was allowing Quran Sunnah naskh.
That was the pivotal moment, theoretically championed by al-Shafi'i. The Hadith school theorized that Hadith, the prophetic tradition, could abrogate the Quran. This was essential because it elevated the Sunnah to an equal source of legislation, and functionally, it allowed scholars to use a single Hadith report to neutralize a foundational Quranic command or principle.
So the Quran was no longer the ultimate final arbiter in all legal matters.
It wasn't.
And when this powerful tool fell into the hands of a hyper-literalist like Ibn Hazm, the consequences were devastating for the pluralistic spirit of the early faith.
The sources show Ibn Hazm used naskh not just to resolve minor legal contradictions, but to fundamentally reshape the legal relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. He claimed that the sword verse from Teviyah chapter 9, a text that contextually related only to specific Meccan polytheists who had broken peace covenants during a specific historical period, he claimed it abrogated a massive number of tolerant verses.
90 verses, the source notes? That's a huge shift.
It is. He argued that this single conditional verse abrogated 90 verses promoting tolerance, patience, peace, and coexistence. And he generalized the mandate of the sword verse to include all polytheists, regardless of any covenant, and even contemporary al-Kitab, the people of the book.
How did he justify that?
By claiming those contemporary groups were not the true al-Kitab mentioned in the original text.
So he took a surgical tool, a verse aimed at specific combatants, and turned it into a generalized legal warhammer. He effectively nullified the majority of the Quran's specific injunctions through legal fiat.
It demonstrates the immense power invested in the tool of naskh and how a selective, literal interpretation of the Hadith tradition could fundamentally override and reshape the entire ethical framework of the religion. It's the triumph of rigidity over flexibility.
But the crisis of authority wasn't just limited to Hadith contradictions. The source suggests that this culture of legal and political maneuvering in the use of naskh extended even to narratives concerning the textual integrity of the Quran itself, the mushaf.
This is a truly remarkable and often unsettling aspect of early Islamic history that the sources document. The Quran is supposed to be the measure, the mizan, against all other religious information. Yet, because of this intense focus on Hadith and abrogation, narratives started circulating and were accepted by prominent Sunni and Shia authorities that undermine the notion of the Quran as this perfectly preserved, singular text.
Narratives about what, missing verses?
Missing or abrogated verses, yeah.
Yeah.
Tilvat naskh, verses whose recitation was allegedly forgotten, lost, or removed during the official compilation of the Mushaf.
What are some of the specific examples the sources provide that claim verses were lost?
The most famous one relates to the verses about suckling that established kinship prohibition. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, and a primary source of Hadith, claimed that the verses originally commanded prohibition after 10 known sucklings. She then stated this was later abrogated by 5 known sucklings.
Okay, that seems like a legal detail that just changed, but what's the textual issue?
The textual issue is that Aisha reportedly claimed that the Prophet died while this 5-suckling verse was still being recited as part of the Quran text. Yet this verse is nowhere to be found in the Uthmanic Mushaf, the definitive compiled text used universally today.
So if you accept that narrative, it implies a clear textual loss or alteration in the definitive compiled text.
It suggests human forgetfulness or political decision-making affected the final compilation.
And there is the equally contentious case of the Rajrum or stoning verse.
Exactly. Narratives exist where senior figures, most notably Umar, the second caliph, expressed acute fear that the Rajm verse prescribing stoning for adultery might be forgotten by the people. He insisted it was divine law and said he would have included it in the Quran if he hadn't feared people questioning the text, despite its absence from the Quran itself.
So the ruling exists solely through the Hadith tradition?
Solely.
So these narratives, even if they're ultimately rejected by strict textual purists, they demonstrate the theological landscape of the time. If the Hadith school was claiming the Sunnah could abrogate the Quran and simultaneously claiming that parts of the Quran itself were lost, it profoundly weakened the Quran's unique status as the perfectly preserved Word of God.
It did. It transformed it into a text subject to human intervention and historical accident. The sources arguing these internal narratives gave enormous ammunition to external opponents of Islam to question the textual integrity of the entire revelation. It was a crisis of epistemology. What is the ultimate, unassailable source of truth?
And this situation sets the stage perfectly for a political confrontation where certainty had to be imposed by the state. The intellectual battleground moves to the caliph's court, leading directly to the infamous Mina.
The Mina, or Inquisition, which began in the early Abbasid period under Caliph al-Ma'mun, was the state-sponsored attempt to resolve this foundational crisis of authority. And it did so by focusing on one very abstract theological question.
And what was the core theological issue that the caliphate was trying to enforce?
The debate was, is the Quran created, Maluk, or uncreated, Qadim? The Mu'tazilite school, the rationalist movement favored by the caliphs, insisted the Quran must be created in time. They were focused intensely on maintaining the absolute unity of God, Tawhid.
Help us connect those dots. Why did believing the Quran was uncreated violate Tawhid?
This is the critical linkage. If the Quran was uncreated, Qadim, it meant it existed eternally outside of time alongside God. The Mu'tazilites feared that postulating two eternal entities, God and His Word, was a form of associationism, a kind of subtle polytheism or shirk. For them, the Quran had to be a created attribute, not an eternal one, to maintain God's absolute singular eternity. They wanted a God unconstrained by an existing eternal text.
And the Al-Hadith rejected this rationalist conclusion because they feared it would degrade the status of the sacred text.
Yes. And Ahmed B. Hanbal, a highly respected figure and collector of Hadith, became the symbolic leader of the resistance. He refused to declare the Quran created. He would only say it was the Word of God.
And this refusal wasn't just theological, it was deeply political.
Deeply. It represented a popular rejection of the caliphate's attempt to impose rationalist philosophical theology as state doctrine. And the Mu'tazilites, for their part, were deeply skeptical of the vast, often contradictory Hadith literature that the Al-Hadith was trying to elevate.
So the Mina was an attempt by the state to use reason, Aql, to enforce theological purity, but it failed to win over the people.
Precisely. The state imposed a doctrine through persecution across 3 successive caliphs. Ahmed B. Hanbal was imprisoned and tortured for his steadfast refusal, and that turned him into a martyr and a popular symbol of resistance against the state's intellectual overreach.
So how did the tide turn? Who ended the Mina, and what was the political genius behind that shift?
The revolution came around 234 AH, or 848 CE, with Caliph al-Mutawakkil. Mutawakkil was far more politically pragmatic than his predecessors. He saw that the previous caliphs had failed to impose their religious will on the populace. He realized that rulers needed the people's sincere religious support to stabilize the empire, not just forced compliance.
He recognized the political capital in aligning himself with the popular movement of the Al-Hadith.
Absolutely. Mutawakkil's shift was a political calculation, first and foremost. By overturning the Mina and aligning with the popular Hadith faction, he garnered immense public goodwill and solidified his own temporal authority by claiming the mantle of religious protector. He ceased all debate and fully supported the Hadith faction and elevated Ahmed B. Hanbal and his allies.
How did he solidify this new theological orthodoxy? He couldn't have just stopped the persecution. He had to aggressively promote the Hadith narrative.
He took systematic action. He distributed enormous wealth to scholars who supported the Hadith narrative. And most importantly, he ordered the preaching of Hadith that specifically condemned the Mu'tazilites and anyone who engaged in theological dialectics, or kalam. This was a state-sponsored campaign to crush rationalism and enshrine adherence to tradition as orthodoxy.
This political victory seems to have paved the way for a cult of personality around figures like Ahmed B. Hanbal, further institutionalizing the victory of tradition over reason.
That is exactly what happened. The political need to legitimize the new orthodoxy led to the creation of an extensive hagiography around Ahmed B. Hanbal to solidify his position as the Imam of the Sunnah, a title that placed him beyond critique.
And his suffering was exaggerated.
The sources detail how his suffering was exaggerated to maximize his martyr status. His actual prison time, while horrific, may have been far shorter than later claims. And they introduced miraculous stories, essentially propaganda, to ensure the public bought into his sanctity.
What kind of stories?
The accounts include these exaggerated narratives of miraculous events during his torture, like his garment miraculously staying up when his belt broke during the flogging. These were stories meant to capture the popular imagination and affirm his divine protection.
And we also have to talk about the use of dream narratives, which seems to have been an accepted, if highly questionable, form of political legitimation.
Yes, dream narratives became a common tool. Accounts were circulated that claimed the prophet appeared in dreams to endorse Mutawakil's support for the Hadith school, effectively giving divine sanction to the political revolution.
Wow.
Other dreams portrayed Mutawakil being forgiven by God for past sins because he held onto a little sunnah. These stories were circulated widely to cement the new regime and the new Hadith orthodoxy.
And conversely, those who opposed the Hadith camp, they suffered immediate social annihilation, even if they were brilliant scholars.
The example of the Sufi Haris al-Muhasibi is tragic. He was a leading representative of Islamic thought at the time, but his association with Kalam, with theology, was fiercely condemned by Ibn Hanbal and his followers. The sources record that when al-Muhasibi died, only 4 people attended his funeral.
Just 4.
It demonstrates the crushing social and political power the Hadith faction now wielded over intellectual pluralism and rational inquiry.
So once the al-Ahadith achieved political dominance with state backing, they inherited a massive practical problem. They had just elevated tens of thousands of sometimes contradictory reports, the Hadith, to the status of divine law. Now they had to clean up the mess.
That's the irony of their victory. The proliferation of Hadith eventually forced scholars to develop entirely new, complex scientific apparatuses to deal with the sheer volume and contradictions. The science of Hadith criticism, Ilm al-Hadith. It was a necessity born of their own success.
How extensive was this phenomenon of Hadith inflation?
Immense. The sources confirm that the number of Ahad reports narratives transmitted by only a single chain of narrators grew exponentially. It reached tens of thousands in compilations like Ahmad B. Hanbal's Musnad. This huge volume of material, much of it potentially conflicting with the Quran or with itself, required systematic processing.
And this led to the canonical collections.
It led to the Siyasita, the 6 sound books.
So what was the core mechanism developed for determining authenticity? Where did the focus shift?
The key epistemological shift was from the matan, the content or text, to the isnad, the chain of narrators. The primary criterion for a hadith's authenticity shifted away from whether the text made rational sense or contradicted the Quran to whether the chain of transmission was sound, sahih al-isnad.
So if the chain was deemed strong, the text was accepted as authentic and binding, regardless of logical or theological issues within the content itself.
So was the principle.
And this has profound implications, especially for those odd reports, the ones transmitted by just one trustworthy person.
Absolutely. The material highlights that the Hadith methodology, especially as formalized by Shafi'i, argued that the Prophet spoke only by revelation, even in non-Quranic matters. So if a single trustworthy narrator, a Sikha, like Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, produced numerous unique single-chain reports, the system essentially elevated that individual narrator to a secondary legislator.
So divine law was then bindingly established based on the memory and integrity of just one human being.
Yes.
The quantity of specific binding rules derived from these reports must have dwarfed the broad guidance of the Quran.
It did. The sources argue that this system created thousands of specific rules, often about very mundane matters, and it effectively sidelined the Quran's more general ethical guidance. And when these single-chain reports inevitably contradicted each other, scholars were forced into intellectual acrobatics to maintain the theological premise that the Prophet, as a source of divine law, could not contradict himself.
Which forced the development of these huge literary works dedicated solely to reconciling contradictory hadiths.
Yes. The focus shifted from critical thinking about the content to forced harmonization. Scholars like Ibn Qutayba wrote Tawil Mutalif al-Hadith, the interpretation of contradictory hadith. Later, al-Tahawi wrote Bayan Mushkil al-Hadith, explanation of problematic hadith.
How extensive were these efforts at resolution? What methods were they using?
They were exhaustive. Al-Tahawi, writing a half-century after Ibn Qutayba, opened over 1,000 sections in his work to resolve contradictions in over 6,000 hadiths. This often required tawil reinterpretation, forced allegory, inventive contextualization, or what the source critically refers to as wahim, or vehicular deception, just to preserve the hadith's perceived authenticity.
Let's look at a specific example of this forced reconciliation because it really demonstrates the intellectual lengths they went to.
Certainly. Consider the need to reconcile 2 opposing hadiths about unsolicited testimony. One report praised spontaneous testimony as the best testimony,
Okay.
while another explicitly condemned it as the worst form of testimony.
Those are irreconcilable opposites.
They are. So how did scholars like al-Hazimi deal with that?
How did he?
In his work on preference, Tarji, he tried to reconcile them by inventing hidden contextual factors, a zarf, that weren't present in either text. He argued that the hadith condemning unsolicited testimony applied when there was no urgent need for it, but the hadith praising it applied when there was an urgent need, like a witness to a murder who might be about to leave town.
Wait, so he inserted a massive contextual assumption urgency that wasn't mentioned in the reports themselves just to save them from contradiction.
Exactly. The source critically labels this technique a hocus-pocus maneuver, a term the author uses to denote an intentional maneuver to mask blatant logical contradictions. The paramount goal was always to preserve the sanctity and the quantity of the transmitted reports, never to discard them based on rational scrutiny of the content.
And beyond these internal contradictions, the integrity of the transmission process itself, the isnad, was highly prone to errors and even intentional manipulation, right? Which would make the hadith science less reliable than its proponents claimed.
That's a crucial point. The material lists several serious perils in the transmission science. One common issue was tedlis, or deception in the chain. Narrators would sometimes conceal the identity of a weak or unknown source to make the chain appear unbroken, muttasil, even if they hadn't heard the hadith directly from the named authority.
But if they required such rigorous chains, why was deception allowed?
It was often tolerated if the underlying concealed source was later deemed trustworthy by the hadith masters. This practice, however, fundamentally undermines the entire premise of the isnad method, the unbroken verified link of hearing.
And the reliance on books and memory over direct, verified hearing seems to have compounded the problem.
It did. The process known as ijaza, permission to transmit, diluted authenticity immensely. Narrators often permitted others to copy their books without the original narrator having read the content aloud, which is called sama. This meant the transmitter might never have actually heard the text from the source they were citing.
And this dilution reached its extreme with those granting ijaza to people who couldn't possibly have heard the hadith.
Yes, the source gives the mind-boggling example that some narrators even granted permission to transmit their reports to those yet-to-be-born children still in the womb just to ensure the reports continued.
That's incredible.
It's an extreme legal fiction that completely eroded the concept of rigorous, direct authentication. It proved that the priority was the survival of the report, not its verifiable origin.
And finally, we have the ultimate failure point, outright hadith fabrication, or madu'at.
The necessity of the madu'at genre, fabricated hadith, arose to catalog these errors. Scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi recognized this crisis of content, and it led him to prioritize matbrem, textual content criticism, over mere isnad chain criticism. He made the radical statement, know that every hadith, contrary to what is rational, maqul, is fabricated. He shifted the focus back to reason.
Why did so many people fabricate hadith? Was it always malicious?
Not always malicious, but overwhelmingly ideological. Fabrication was driven by political, sectarian, and sometimes even pietistic motives, like fabricating a hadith to encourage good behavior. The sources cite the intense Shia-Sunni rivalry as a massive driver.
Can you provide the example cited regarding the first convert?
Certainly. There was immense pressure and ideological necessity to prove that Abu Bakr, the first caliph, was the first convert to Islam, to legitimize the Sunni political structure. Hadiths were fabricated to support this claim.
But that contradicted the historical accounts.
It directly contradicted historical accounts that placed Khadija, the Prophet's wife, Ali, his cousin, and Zayd bi Haritha, his freed slave, ahead of him. The source quotes Tabari, who noted that some historical accounts put over 50 people ahead of Abu Bakr.
So, in this whole process of hadith elevation and codification, history was often consciously rewritten to serve the needs of the victorious theological and political faction, divorcing the final hadith text from rigorous historical or rational scrutiny.
That is the ultimate conclusion of this historical transformation. The perceived infallibility of the hadith text became a tool for ideological victory, often at the expense of intellectual rigor.
What does this transformation from a Quran-centered faith where reason, aqal, was celebrated, to a hadith-centered orthodoxy supported by state power, what does that mean for the long-term intellectual legacy of Islamic civilization?
The source argues that the victory of ideological Hadithism was a profoundly detrimental historical event. It led directly to the sidelining of the Quran as the ultimate measure, the marginalization of reason, and the crushing of intellectual pluralism.
We saw the Mutazilites persecuted, but how was reason itself systemically suppressed across the intellectual landscape?
The rise of Hadith orthodoxy created an intellectual climate where the rational sciences were fiercely attacked as dangerous foreign elements. Kalam, theology and dialectics, and philosophy were often equated with heresy or zundik by leading Hadith figures. We recall Ahmed B. Hanbal's condemnation of theologians as zundiks.
So this systematic attack just closed off the channels for critical thinking, for speculative inquiry, for the philosophical adaptation that had driven the early Islamic Golden Age.
That's the argument. Instead of using rational tools, logic, analogy, historical context to interpret texts or adapt law, the reliance shifted entirely to rote transmission and uncritical acceptance of traditions that were often demonstrably contradictory or fabricated.
Intellectual gate closed.
It closed. The source material suggests that this intellectual closure, the decision to sideline Aql in favor of absolute adherence to single-chain reports, regardless of their content coherence, marks the start of a long decline toward a new Middle Ages for the civilization. The culture ceased to be intellectually self-correcting or adaptable, preferring certainty from transmission over truth derived from reason.
The journey we've taken today, from the definition of the prophet as messenger, Rasul, to the elevation of the Hadith via political force in the Mina, and the subsequent intellectual crisis of textual contradictions, it shows this was not some monolithic development. It was a 3-century-long struggle defined by deep intellectual divides.
And if you look at the source material, the shift from Quran Islam to Hadith Islam was driven by a complex interplay. The pragmatic need for legal scalability during conquest, the theological desire for certainty, and eventually the political opportunity provided by Caliph Mutawakkil. The ultimate cost, the source argues, was the marginalization of critical rationalism.
So this debate over the ultimate source of authority, the explicit divine text versus the transmitted human tradition, is fundamentally a debate over the role of human reason, interpretation, and religion. The source material suggests that the only way for the civilization to revitalize its intellectual life is to reopen the channels of reason and return to the Quran as the ultimate measure, the mizan, even if that means critically reevaluating established traditions built over centuries. Do you, the learner, agree that the intellectual freedom of a civilization is directly tied to the freedom of its foundational sacred texts from cultural and political interpretation?
Welcome back. Today we're looking at a deeply analytical piece that traces the shift from what it calls Quran Islam to Hadith Islam. This is really rigorous work, so let's jump right in.
Absolutely. The level of detail here is incredible. The author has done a phenomenal job deconstructing the whole theological and legal apparatus of the Hadith-centric schools.
It's a massive amount of evidence. And I think that's actually the core challenge we're seeing, right? Managing that incredible scope.
Yeah. The analysis is just so comprehensive. It hits the theological, legal, and historical fronts all at once, which is brilliant, but it can feel a little overwhelming for the reader.
Exactly. You've got these really sophisticated historical points, like the politics of the Mehenna or the role of the Mawali.
Kind of synthesize all of it simultaneously. The richness is there, but the main thrust of the argument can get a bit blurred.
So that leads us straight to our first point. To really maximize the impact here, you need to strengthen the central thesis by explicitly defining the pillars of the Hadith paradigm under attack.
Yes. Give the reader a roadmap, a clear framework for the polemic you're building.
Instead of this one sprawling argument, you could have, say, dedicated, labeled sections for each key shift.
Positioning them as distinct pillars that Hadith Islam relies upon. So let's make that a bit more concrete.
Okay.
We think you could structure the main body around maybe 3 or 4 of these pillars that you're systematically taking apart. And the first one has to be the theological pillar.
Which is really about the definition of the prophet's role itself, isn't it?
That's the heart of it. You need to focus on that shift from the prophet as a messenger, a rasul, the divine conduit, to elevating him to the status of a legislator, a shari.
Because that elevation is what opens the door to the whole idea of extra Quranic revelation being codified as law.
And you already have fantastic material on this. The textual evidence showing the prophet's fallibility outside of revelation is, it's really strong.
You mean the examples where the Quran itself corrects them?
Use those. Use them right up front. The events in Ali Imran 128 or Tawbah 43, even the Quranic incident, hitting those immediately establishes a divine boundary on his role. It just fundamentally challenges the later Hadith narrative from the get-go.
So you isolate the root theological problem before you even get to the legal consequences. That makes sense. What's next?
The second pillar would be the jurisprudential pillar. And here you've got to focus on the one doctrinal mechanism that allowed the Quran to be, subjugated.
Naskh, abrogation.
Specifically, the claim that the Sunnah could abrogate the Quran. That's a huge point. It allows a foundational text to be overruled by later, much weaker sources. It deserves its own spotlight.
It's the hinge, really. The whole legal power structure rests on it.
It really is. And so for the third pillar, you need to attack the proof itself, the mechanism.
The epistemological pillar, the failure of the isnad, the chain of transmission, as the primary claim to truth.
And this is where you can bring in the idea of hadith inflation. It's such a powerful concept. This reliance on the chain, often, at the expense of the actual content, the mutton.
It just led to this explosion of reports.
An exponential explosion. And the data point here is just gripping. You can show the drastic shift in volume. Contrast an early compilation like Malik's Muwatta with something like Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad.
Which has, tens of thousands of reports?
Exactly. It's hard evidence of a systemic breakdown. It shows a system that started prioritizing quantity and the perceived soundness of a chain over actual textual fidelity.
Okay, so that gives the reader three very clear, logically connected targets. The Prophet's authority, the Naskh override, and the flawed isnad system. That's a much clearer framework.
Right.
But a solid structure doesn't guarantee the reader stays hooked, does it? How do we make sure they're gripped from page one?
Well, that's our second critique. Maximize engagement by front-loading the most absurd consequences of literalism.
I love this idea. Your best stuff is when you contrast the Quran's clarity with the, frankly, convoluted logic of the Hadith schools. But some of the most powerful case studies are kind of buried right now.
Yeah. The weakness is that the technical discussions, like the debate over qiyas or the nuances of transmission, they're inherently abstract. The author delays the payoff.
So the suggestion is pretty simple.
Just isolate the most vivid examples of legal absurdity and put them right at the front. Use them as anchors to introduce the abstract concepts.
So for instance, don't start with the dry definition of qiyas or analogical reasoning.
No, start with its failure. When you're critiquing the rejection of qiyas and aql, or rationality, you should open with that infamous example, Ibn Hazm's analysis of the dead mouse and liquid fat hadith.
Wait, so there's a Zahiri school, they really insisted on that level of literalism?
They did. And the sheer specificity is what makes it so powerful. You have to emphasize his conclusion. The ruling applies only to a mouse and only in liquid fat.
So it couldn't be extended to, say, a sewer rat in a jar of olive oil?
Nope, because the source text didn't mention olive oil or sewer rats.
That's what you need to lead with. It's an immediate, almost comical demonstration of how this kind of extreme literalism just cripples reason. It's so much more compelling than starting with a definition.
It shows with one jarring anecdote how the methodology, taken to its extreme, actively fought against intellectual judgment. The stakes for the reader go way up, instantly.
Okay, so what about showing the fragility of the transmission chain itself? How can we use high-impact examples there?
I think when you discuss the isnad, you should focus on the data that reveals the human subjective element. For instance, you could highlight the critique of an early authority like Malik. He uses terms like ura, I think, or ohebu, I prefer, over 95 times in his own Muwatta transmission.
It shows the source was always seen through a human editorial lens.
Exactly. And building on that, you can show the internal contradictions. Use the example of the prophet prostrating during the Najm Surah. The reports are all over the place.
Or the debate over kinship through suckling, the radha.
Yes, the sheer variety of conflicting numbers attributed to the prophet on that one issue just completely undermines any notion of a single unified sunnah. It's chaos.
Okay, excellent. So by front-loading these examples, the mouths, the subjective language, the contradictions, you pull the reader into the argument before they get bogged down in the terminology.
Precisely.
Now let's talk about the biggest claim in the work, the conclusion. This is maybe the most critical part to get right.
This is where we need to sharpen the socio-historical diagnosis of civilizational decline.
Right. The material ends with this massive claim that the victory of what you call ideological hadithism suppressed reason, aql, and led to a long period of decline in Arab Islamic civilization.
It's a huge claim.
And that link between specialized law and macro history, it just needs to be reinforced more strongly throughout the whole text.
The weakness right now is that the discussion of historical figures can feel a bit like hagiography, like the dramatic and often disputed accounts of Ahmad ibn Hanbal's suffering during the Mihna.
They're treated as these isolated, personal anecdotes.
Right, rather than as critical links in the systematic, institutional suppression of intellectual freedom. The focus shifts to personal drama instead of the socio-political consequences.
So the suggestion is to explicitly connect the dots. Link the methodological choices of the scholars, like prioritizing isnad over mats or rejecting aql for the literal text, directly to the socio-political outcome.
We need to frame events like the Mihna, not just as biography, but as an institutional mandate, a mandate that favored dogma over inquiry.
Okay, so how do you do that specifically?
Look at the section on the Caliph Mutawakkil and his role in rehabilitating the Hadith scholars. You need to frame his move as a calculated political inqilab, a revolution.
So not just a religious decision, but a strategic move to consolidate power by appealing to popular sentiment?
Against the intellectual elite, the Mu'tazila, whose rationalism was seen as a threat.
Okay, that recontextualizes the whole thing. It wasn't an organic religious victory. It was a political maneuver that then dictated the future of intellectual life. The state essentially endorsed one methodology.
And you have the perfect, concrete evidence to show the chilling effect that had.
Let me guess.
The funeral. The anecdote of Haris al-Mu'abbasi's poorly attended funeral. It's pure gold.
The story that only 4 people showed up, supposedly because Ahmed ibn Hanbal disapproved of his engagement with Kalam, with theological philosophy.
That one data point is definitive evidence. It's not a theoretical decline anymore. It's the immediate, visible suppression of intellectual diversity in the wake of the Hadith triumph. It shows that the preference for dogma wasn't just debated, it dictated who was intellectually and socially permitted to exist.
That is the link. The direct link between a specialized legal choice and the civilizational trajectory. That's what needs to be hammered home.
Right. The goal is to move beyond just narrating the shift and to fully theorize why that shift dictated the intellectual future of an entire civilization.
This is really fantastic. The material's already so strong, and these changes are about making sure the structure serves that evidence perfectly.
So, just to recap the main points. First, impose that structural clarity. Define those 3 or 4 distinct pillars you're dismantling: the theological shift, the use of nask, the epistemological fragility.
Second, maximize engagement by front-loading your most powerful, almost absurd case studies. The Ibn Hazm mouse ruling, the subjectivity in Malik's Muwatta. Get them in early.
And third, sharpen that socio-historical diagnosis. Consistently connect the micro-jurisprudence to the macro-historical decline, using evidence like Mutawakkil's political inqilab and the chilling effect shown by Haris al-Muhasabi's funeral.
These suggestions really just focus on refining the structure and maximizing the impact of your most compelling points. We are really encouraged by the scholarship here, and we invite you to refine the material and submit it again for a follow-up critique.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are discussing one of the most foundational issues in Islamic thought, the precise scope of authority granted to the Prophet Muhammad, the Rasul or messenger, and how that defines the status of his practice, the Sunnah, when it's measured against the Quran itself.
And this relationship is, well, it's anything but theoretical. It fundamentally dictates how Islamic law, the Shari, is constructed. The core question is this: does the Quran portray the Rasul primarily as a conveyor, someone whose job is just to transmit the message, the tabli, or was he an independent legislator, someone whose Sunnah is an autonomous source of religious law, right alongside the revealed book?
I'll be arguing that the Rasul's role necessarily extends beyond mere recitation. The faith itself seems to demand active legislation. My position is that obedience is required not just for the text, but for the living interpretation and the law-giving of the messenger, which makes the Sunnah an indispensable binding source of law.
And I will be arguing that the Quran itself consistently restricts the messenger's role to conveyance and warning, and that it's Allah alone who is the singular lawgiver. I'll maintain that the elevation of the Sunnah to an equal source was a consequential historical development, yes, but one that happened after the Prophet's time, really tied to the expansion of the Arab Islamic Empire, what our source calls Futuhat Islama.
So when we actually look at the text, the most powerful evidence for me lies in that dual command you see repeated over and over in the Quran: obey Allah and obey the Rasul. Now, if the Rasul's only function was delivering a text, then just obeying Allah's command in that text would be enough. That dual command, you find it in verses like Nisa 4:13, it becomes, well, redundant if the Sunnah isn't a distinct source of authority. And you have to look at the practical application. The messenger's authority was clearly meant to go into governance, into material distribution. I mean, consider the instruction in Surah Al-Hashr, where believers are told to accept what the messenger gives them from spoils of war and to refrain from what he withholds. The text is explicit, and later jurists were absolutely right to cite this to establish the Rasul's authority in matters of property. This isn't just reciting a text, this is actively setting rules. And beyond that, practical religious life, how to pray, how to perform the pilgrimage, it's all defined by the Sunnah. Jurists like Malik bin Anas knew this. He often emphasized the amal, the consistent practice of the people of Medina, sometimes even prioritizing that living tradition over an isolated report.
The problem, though, with relying only on those obedience verses is that you're lifting them out of a much broader context, and that context is one of limitation. The Quranic portrayal of Muhammad is, I would argue, consistently one of curtailing his discretionary power, reinforcing that he is a human, a bashar, who is only infallible when he's delivering direct revelation. The text itself says this repeatedly. For example, "Bu işte senin yapacağın hiçbir şey yoktur." You have no part in this matter, or even about guidance. "Onları hidayete getirmek senin görevin değildir." Guiding them is not your responsibility. Our source is very clear on this. Dozens of verses restrict his role, and they funnel all ultimate authority back to Allah as the sole lawgiver. The linguistic evidence here is, I think, crucial. Muhammad is called Rasulullah, messenger of God, dozens of times. A messenger delivers a message, but he is never called Nabiullah, prophet of God, not in a single verse. The term Nabi is often associated with, independent lawgiving. So for me, this linguistic precision confirms his function is delivery, not sovereignty. And finally, we have to acknowledge the fact that the phrase Rasulullah Sunnati, the Sunnat of the messenger, it just doesn't exist in the Quran. Sunnat is reserved for Allah's Sunnati, God's way. The conceptual leap to make Sunnat an equal authority to the Quran, that belongs firmly to the post-prophetic period.
I see the textual evidence you're citing about limitations, but those very limitations, I think, only serve to highlight the importance of the Sunnah when he is acting under divine mandate. If his actions were never binding, why would Allah take the time to correct them? The correction confirms that when he does speak on matters of faith and Sharia, his word is guidance.
That's a powerful way to put it, but I have to disagree with the premise. Corrections only happen when independent human judgment is being applied, not when he's acting as a divine legislator. If his actions were inherently legislative and sanctioned by God, there would be no reason for the Quran to step in and critique them. Right, and consider two explicit examples from the source material. First, the incident in the Abashay Surah. The Prophet turns away from the blind man Abdullah bin Maktum to engage with some high-status elites. And the revelation is critical of this human error in priority. Second, the correction he receives for granting permission to hypocrites to sit out the Tabuk expedition. In both cases, the Prophet acted based on his own human assessment, what the source calls isabet eder veyanalar. He may be right or he may err. The Quran steps in, and in doing so, it asserts its absolute supremacy over human judgment, even the judgment of the messenger. That is the text saying he's a bashar, a human, and that he doesn't have autonomous legislative authority.
But those incidents confirm the boundaries of his humanity, sure, not the erosion of his authority in legal matters. When his action is corrected, it shows the ultimate source of law is the wahi, the revelation, which he conveys. But the sunnah is the form that revelation takes when it's applied to the real world. I'm just not convinced these corrections undermine the authority of sunnah. I think they fortify the belief that when the Prophet did act on Sharia, it was under divine oversight, and so it was absolutely binding. And look at the immediate legislative acts that followed a revelation. When the verse in Surah An-Nasr about non-combatants was revealed, it was immediately modified to include except those with a valid excuse after the blind man Amr bin Maktoum asked about his situation. That was a direct, immediate, and necessary clarification, a legislative act, derived from new revelation.
The sunnah is required to provide the essential practical detail that the Quran, in its high-level guidance, often doesn't contain. Obeying the Rasul, as mandated in verses like the Gabun 612, has to include obeying the applied law, the sunnah. Otherwise, the faith is it's unworkable in daily practice.
But that argument, the one about practical necessity, that's precisely what drove the historical institutionalization of hadith. And we have to analyze that because necessity doesn't automatically mean divine mandate. The growing authority of hadith was an historical process, not some theological given, and it created, frankly, severe epistemological problems. The source material calls it the tabulation of the knots, where hadith became systematically integrated into law, which essentially led to the Quranization of hadith. We see this explosive growth of hadith material in the 3rd century of the Hijra. Reports just swells into the tens of thousands, all protected by the isnad system, the chain of transmission. The problem here is that the criteria for authenticity shifted almost entirely from the matan, the actual content of the report, to the sanad, the chain of people who transmitted it. So the focus became, did this chain of trustworthy people say this? Instead of asking, does the content itself contradict the Quran or logic or established history? And this is what allowed individual reports, ahad hadith, which are very susceptible to error, to accumulate and eventually dictate law, often filling gaps that, you could argue, should have been addressed by human reasoning, by aql.
I can't let that characterization of the muhaddith, the hadith scholars, stand unchallenged. The rigor that figures like Bukhari and Muslim applied was all about preservation. It was a methodical, exhaustive effort to preserve the Prophet's comprehensive guidance. Without it, the religious understanding of that young empire would have just collapsed into regional chaos and arbitrary opinion. And jurists like Shafi'i, who often mediated between the hadith schools and the schools of human reason, or Ray, he recognized that sunnah was essential for jurisprudence. You ask how the faith works without sunnah? Well, it doesn't. If we only rely on the Quran, we have a command to pray, but absolutely no detail on the movements, the timings, the ritual form. We rely entirely on sunnah for that. And the belief in the power of sunnah was so strong that some scholars even claimed the sunnah could abrogate or cancel Quranic verses. That idea alone shows the absolute, comprehensive legislative scope they believed the Prophet's role had.
That the rise of this massive, authoritative hadith corpus wasn't purely a scholarly project. It was deeply political. The source material draws a crucial link here. Take the era of the Caliph Mutawakkil, around 234 AH. He explicitly supported and empowered hadith scholars, even calling Ahmed bin Hanbal the Imam of the Sunnah. And why? This was during the Mikna controversy, the theological battle over whether the Quran was created or eternal. Mutawakkil saw the hadith scholars who championed the eternal Quran in strict adherence to texts as the perfect institutional counterweight to the rationalist theology of the Mu'tazila school. So by elevating the authority of the Sunnah and its keepers, the state successfully codified a textualist form of authority against rational inquiry. This historical reality, for me, undermines a claim that the Sunnah's status rose just because of some inherent divine necessity.
I acknowledge the political context, of course, but political endorsement doesn't invalidate the scholarly rigor or the underlying need. Even without Mutawakkil,
Jurists would have required the Sunnah to deal with the complexities of their expanding civilization. The ultimate danger isn't political interference, it's the radical conclusion that follows when you see the Nas, the textual revelation, as the only source of law, which eliminates human reason entirely. I mean, look at the Zahiri school with figures like Ibn Hazm. They rejected human reasoning, aql, and analogy, qiyas, completely. They argued every single ruling must come directly from the specific words of Allah or the Rasul. This kind of extreme literalism, it shows the intellectual paralysis that results when you try to govern the world only by the textual corpus. It forces the Sunnah, however you got it, to bear the entire weight of supplementary legislation.
I agree that Zahiri literalism is an extreme and impractical endpoint, but it's the logical conclusion of giving the Sunnah co-equal legislative authority. But let's look at your own evidence. Malik bin Anas, you cited him as a supporter of Sunnah through Amal, but even he, an early textualist, showed incredible judicial freedom in his Muwatta. He uses phrases like era, I think, or la era, I don't think, dozens of times. He would sometimes even reject an isolated hadith if it contradicted the persistent practice of the Medina community. This shows that even in the earliest period, there was a necessary human filter being applied to the textual tradition. Now, if the Sunnah were a truly unassailable, autonomous source of law, why would the founder of a major legal school need to use such pronounced judicial discretion against specific hadith? This tension exists because the material collected as sunnat was often contradictory or incomplete or highly contextualized, and so it required interpretation and filtering.
But that judicial filtering only reinforces my position. The need for fiqh, for jurisprudence, arose precisely because the Quran provided the foundation, but the Sunnah provided the necessary detail and the framework for application. The vast Islamic civilization that emerged from the conquests presented complex legal problems, inheritance, taxation, manumission that required specific rulings. Jurists had no choice but to rely on the Prophet's practices as the primary lens through which the Quran's general principles were applied. Whether you call it legislative or explicative in functional terms, the Sunnah operates as a distinct source of shari, and the command to obey the Rasul is the divine mandate for that very function.
I think our discussion has shown we converge on the ultimate authority of the Quran and the need to obey the messenger. The central disagreement, though, it remains fixed on the scope of that authority. Was the Rasul a perfect conduit restricted to the clear conveyance of the text, the tabligh, allowing human reason to operate where the text was silent?
Or was he endowed with a supplementary, independent legislative role, as evidenced by the commands to obey him and the functional needs of the faith, a role that forms the binding basis of the Sunnah, which is necessary for the comprehensive, practical application of Islamic law.
The journey from what's sometimes called Quran Islam to the institutional dominance of Hadith Islam, especially through historical events like the Mehna and that shift in validation from Metin to Sened, it really illustrates how the definition of divine authority has been forged not just by text, but by very complex historical, political, and scholarly dynamics. It's a perpetual tension that I think forces us all to weigh the evidence for ourselves.
The way these two authorities, the explicit text and the operative practice, interact really defines the intellectual landscape of Islamic law to this day. It's clear that material compels us to ask how deeply that divine command, obey the messenger, truly extends into the realm of human lawgiving. And there is certainly much more to unpack within this complex tradition.